Okay, in this video we will talk through some important quotes that you might want to use if you get a question on authority in Of Mice and Men. You don't have to use these quotes, but they give you opportunity to talk about a number of different characters who either have or don't have authority. If you get a question about this, I think to really get those top marks, you need to really focus not only on the obvious characters that have authority, like Slim and the boss, but you also have to think about the characters who don't have authority as well. Okay, let's get started. So I think right from the get-go, it's clear that George has authority over Lenny. If you just look at the tone in which he speaks to Lenny, he speaks to him sharply. And linked with other things that we've seen, we know that he takes on quite kind of a paternal role, telling off Lenny as if he is his son. Linked with that is how he looks after him. For instance, when they are travelling to the next ranch, he doesn't even allow Lenny to carry his own work card. So we know that Lenny is childlike, he's irresponsible, and George takes on that responsibility, and obviously with that comes a position of power. So even though he has this sharp tone, you might argue it is from a good place. He's looking out for Lenny. And that's supported by the fact that Lenny looks at George helplessly for instruction. This is when Curley is being aggressive towards him. And so we know that he's incredibly dependent on George. He's incapable of making his own decisions, or the right decision at least. And that's where George gets his authority from, the kind of the dependence that Lenny has. And then finally, it's interesting when he kills Curly's wife, he doesn't worry about anyone else. He doesn't think about Curly. He doesn't think about any of the ranch workers. He thinks about the repercussions from George. Okay, what's George's punishment going to be? So this can be quite childlike. Like a child might not imagine their life outside of their home and their parents being kind of the ultimate authority. He sees George as the ultimate authority. He doesn't have the mental capacity to think beyond that and think about the greater repercussions of the fact that he's just murdered a woman, that being Curly's wife. So how can you link this to context? The authority George has over Lenny really helps emphasise the vulnerability of the mentally ill and how dependent they were. You might talk about the irony of the authority that George has, considering he has no authority in his life anywhere else. Being an itinerant worker in the 1930s Great Depression meant he had very little choice in his life. He would have had to travel afar to get a job. Once he has a job, he's at the mercy of his boss. He wouldn't have got paid very well. It's just limited options in his life, limited authority. So this is the only real authority you have. You could call into question whether George always treats or looks after Lenny, if that comes from a good place, or is this because it's the only chance he can exercise some power? It's worth exploring. And there's some clear ones. Boss and Curly, they're the landowners basically. They represent the landowners of the 1930s. The boss being the landowner, Curly being his son, who will obviously inherit the land once his father has passed. So what do we notice about both of them? They both wear high-heeled boots. So that's a symbol of their power. You might argue that it represents kind of their desire to intimidate others, and that their desire, what's important to them, is to remind workers of their wealth and status. That's really important to them, and that's what gives them authority in the society that they live in. Looking specifically at the boss, we don't see much of him, but when we do, we notice that he's quite interrogative. He asks lots and lots of questions of George and Lenny. It's interesting, he's really quite suspicious of them. The fact that they travel together, he finds that very unusual. So that kind of highlights the isolation of itinerant workers and the fact that he thinks that this must be a scam, something's going on here. Um, and then he uses a threatening tone with them. Don't try and put nothing over, because you can't get away with nothing. Okay, so look at that threatening tone. The way he feels he can speak to George and Lenny just helps emphasise how powerless George and Lenny are, who represent migrant workers of the 1930s, and how powerful the boss is, who's, you know, a landowner, a farmer of the 1930s. And then look at Curley. Curley won't ever get canned. In other words, he's never going to lose his job, obviously. So he feels he has authority really because of his father, and he's just been born into a family that happened to own land. He's just very lucky. His authority hasn't come from anything other than his father's wealth. So he's not a natural, a naturally powerful or naturally authoritative person. But what does he do with that power? He's described as pugnacious, and he is compared to a terrier. A terrier, you might argue that the imagery there is very good for Curley because he's small and he's vocal, he's the aggressor. So he uses his authority to intimidate others. But again, it's not a natural authority, it's just something that he's been lucky enough to be born into. I've just noticed I've left a Y after authority. So how do you connect this to context? Landowners had ultimate authority in these situations, and here situations we're talking about, you know, on the farm. And Steinbeck really wanted to highlight how landowners exploited cheap labour in the 1930s. Itinerant workers were in a terrible position where unemployment was extremely high. They had to take whatever job they could, and that really ran down the price that landowners were willing to pay, because there were so many people that were desperate for work, and that obviously caused great poverty across the United States. And that's what Steinbeck was trying to really expose here, was just how cruel landowners could be to their ranch workers. And then we get to Slim, a very different character and a good one to talk about contrast, especially with Curley, but the boss also. He's a jerk-line skinner, first of all, so he is highly skilled, and you might argue that some of his authority comes from the fact that he is highly skilled. He's not as replaceable as the other itinerant workers. But in contrast to the boss and Curley, he does have that natural authority that we see. He didn't have to wear high-heeled boots like the boss and Curley. It comes naturally to him. He's described as the prince of the ranch. He is royalty. Now, if you really think back to the belief in like the royal family and why you are royal or you're not, it was believed that you were kind of appointed by God. So this is something that this type of authority has been appointed to him by a higher power, you might argue, rather than just the luck of being born into a family that owns a farm like Curley. So for the ranch workers, his opinions were law. So they respect Slim much more. The boss and Curley may have authority, but they don't have their respect, unlike Slim, who has the ultimate respect of everyone. And that's important because I think it affects the way the reader views Slim. I feel like Steinbeck is encouraging us to really listen to Slim and to believe his opinions as well. So, for instance, the fact that he says Lenny ain't mean, that encourages us as the reader to also think, yeah, you know what? I trust Slim. He has a good judge of character. He is a good judge of character. So if he thinks that Lenny ain't mean, I'm going to think it too, and I'm going to be much more forgiving about Lenny when he does some terrible things later on. But it doesn't mean that he's perfect or he's golden. There are some things that might not sit well with us. For instance, he talks about having all these puppies, and he said he drowned 4 of them. And when George kills Lenny at the end, he repeats, "You had to, George. I swear you had her." So he's not this. He's not pure. He does some things that might not sit well with us morally. But what does that tell you? That we've got someone who actually, in some respects, has that moral authority, seems to be calm, friendly, welcoming, so is a good person. Does that tell you that even if Slim is doing these terrible things like drowning puppies, does that tell you how harsh life was in the 1930s? That even someone as good as Slim, who has that moral authority, would choose um, to do these type of things. And it does. And don't forget, these things here, you might argue, come from good intentions still, even though the act might seem really harsh. He drowns the puppies because he knows they can't all be fed and that they will die eventually. So he doesn't want them to suffer for a very long time, and he wants to give the other puppies a greater chance to live. And then he knows that Lenny is going to be tortured by the ranch workers. Curley is going to get hold of him and make sure he suffers. So he knew it was better that George put him out of his misery in the most loving way, which I know sounds oxymoronic. So you might argue he has moral authority and he makes difficult decisions, but that really reflects the harshness of the 1930s. So what does this tell you? How can we link this, to context? You might argue that Steinbeck was trying to highlight something about economic power and how it goes against the natural order. Slim is the natural leader in this novella, yet he is not the most powerful. It's Curley and the boss. So was Steinbeck trying to say something about economic power and how it didn't necessarily mean the right people who were moral were in the best positions to make decisions for the others? And also, of course, you can link it to the hierarchy of ranch workers. He is a jerk-line skinner, so he would have had more respect because of that as well. And then finally, I think it's always a good idea to bring in characters who don't have any authority whatsoever. And I think the best two choices would be Curley's wife and Crooks, and you could condense both into one paragraph. I would argue that they're the weakest characters in Of Mice and Men. So let's look at why. So for instance, Curley's wife doesn't even have a name. This is linked, you might argue, to women's position in the 1930s. They were seen as the weaker sex. They were seen as insignificant. Their importance really was linked to their husband, hence why she's always referred to as Curley's wife, so we never know her name. And the men who don't even know her, have barely spoken to her, refer to her in many derogatory terms, one of them being tramp. And what has she done really? All she's done is try to start a conversation with them, and they immediately assume that there's some ulterior motive there. And then look at Crooks. First of all, we've got Crooks' name. You might argue that's a symbol not only for the fact that he is physically disabled, but is he socially disabled as well? Because he is a black American. This is in the 1930s, where we have segregation and racial inequality was rife across the United States, especially in the southern states. So does this actually symbolise his position in society? And he is repeatedly referred to in this term as well, which just clearly highlights how racist American society was at that time. But then look also about where they stand whenever we see them. So, for instance, Curley's wife often stands in the entrance or in the doorway. She never enters into male space, so that represents or symbolises the fact that she really lives on the outskirts of society like women did. They weren't really allowed in the public domain, they weren't welcomed in the working world, for instance. They were expected to be at home and be domesticated. And then rather than being in the bunkhouse with the other ranch workers, Crooks has his own shed, which is right next to the stables. So he's closer to the animals than he is the ranch workers, which gives you an idea that he is viewed in more like an animal than he is a human, and that could be linked to the lack of rights that he would have as a black American. Linked with that, there's loads of quotes about Crooks. I've just chosen some. or this one in particular, he holds a mauled copy of the California Civil Code of 1905. So linking that to authority, really think about the irony of that he holds on. Um, he's educating himself about law. This one being the California Civil Code, which did state that all men were equal. However, it also protected the Jim Crow laws of segregation, so that Steinbeck here is trying to highlight the hypocrisy of the policy or the civil code at this time, and how it still allowed the continuation of racism in the United States. The fact that it's mauled, you can look at that in a number of ways. Is it mauled because it's been heavily used and it shows that Crooks is trying to gain more rights, he's trying to educate himself and better his position? Or mauled also sounds quite violent. So does that show his frustration and his anger at the hypocrisy of it? So you could look at it in both ways, or maybe you have your own interpretation. Also, this part's interesting because this you could then reflect on when you have a lack of authority, when you've been treated so harshly, like Curley's wife. Did Steinbeck, through her interaction with Crooks, try and highlight how cruel that can make a person? So, ironically, Curley's wife is treated terribly, but it doesn't encourage her to treat Crooks in a better way. If anything, it encourages her to be absolutely vile towards him. So she says to him, "I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." And here she's referring to lynching, which was something that still took place in the 1930s. It was really a method, obviously it's incredibly violent, but a method of social and racial control to terrorise Black Americans into submission. And this is the tiniest power she has on the ranch. She doesn't have power over anyone else. And so when she gets an opportunity to exercise the small bit of authority that she has, which is over arguably the weakest member of society, this being Crooks, a representation of the Black American community, she takes it because it gives her that tiny bit of satisfaction and that tiny bit of authority that she has nowhere else in her life. And that's not to justify what she says, but I think Steinbeck is trying to highlight that if you mistreat people, it creates this harsh world, and it creates greater hatred, which you can see in this interaction. So certainly you'll want to link this. Like I've said, I've pretty much talked about context all the way through, women's position being of lesser importance, and we can see that in the way Curley's wife is referred to and how she is treated, and you especially see it in Crooks as well. And that's everything. So just remember, you've got, don't just do the obvious and only focus on the boss or only focus on Slim. You'll want to look at authority across the novella to really get those top marks, to make sure you demonstrate your understanding of the novel.